Today's tutorial is machine binding basics. Deonn Stott is here to show us how to easily bind our quilt or project. Hey, welcome, Deonn.
Oh, thank you. So excited to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And Deonn is a regular on Cutting Corners College, and she teaches sewing basics on quilting and other projects. And I loved her tutorial on binding basics. So you're here to show us a few tips on binding.
Today we're going to talk about machine binding. Sometimes you just want to finish your quilt quick, but you want it to look nice too. So yes. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about mitering our corners and that mystery seam at the end so that you can make a continuous seam all the way around your quilt.
And no one can guess where you stopped and started.
There you go. But first, before we do that, we want to talk about the steps that we take to get your binding ready. Your last video, you talked about preparing your binding strips.
Yes.
And
that's an easy way to just pull it out, and I loved your method of the way you store your binding.
Yeah. That way it's not rolling across the room when you're trying to apply it to your quilt.
Yes.
I like to use a cross grain that has just a little bit of give.
Instead of doing it on the bias.
Instead of the bias. I use a bias binding if I'm doing curves or scallops. But I use a cross grain binding, and let me demonstrate that on this fat quarter here. The selvage edge, that's the lengthwise grain.
It doesn't have much give, does it?
The cross grain, though, has just a little bit of give if you need it. And of course the bias is really stretchy. And so that's perfect.
Careful, you can really stretch your binding when you're sewing.
But it's perfect for curves and when you want to do that. So I just use a cross grain. But first I need to decide what the finished size of my binding will be. I like a nice tight 1/4 inch binding size. Okay. And so I use a 2-inch strip.
So you start with a 2-inch.
And that makes it so that I can take a 1/4 inch seam.
If you've got a 1/4 inch foot. You can just sew.
Yeah, and I kind of do things the lazy way, I guess. If I have a 1/4 inch guide on my sewing machine foot, then that holds the quilt there and it makes it nice and even, and it gives a nice finish, nice frame to the quilt.
Now, if you wanted to use a little bigger, wider binding, you just have to adjust the measurements.
Adjust the measurement of your seam allowance.
Okay.
Like a 3/8 inch would probably take a 2 1/4, 2.5 inch strip.
So just make adjustments. Okay.
Right.
Well, let's get started.
Okay. Normally, when you apply binding to your quilt, you're stitching it onto the front side of the quilt, and then turning it towards the back, and either hand stitching or machine stitching it along the back side. But today, because we're doing the machine binding, we're applying it to the back side of the quilt, and then bringing the binding forward, so that we have control of when we finish and how that looks. Maybe even use a decorative stitch when we're done.
Okay, so once you get your binding sewn all along the back.
Well, let's talk about that first. Your binding is been folded and pressed, and the raw edges you'll align with the edge of your quilt.
Okay.
And then I usually use about an 8-inch tail so that I have room to finish that last seam. And take a little back stitch. And let's talk about this mitered corner. We'll take our seam allowance down to the corner and then stop and prepare our little mitered corner. Let's do that on this corner here.
Okay. I think that's the tricky part. So I like the way you explain this.
Okay. Usually I put a little pin about 1/4 of an inch away from the end of the quilt. And that's how I know where to stop the stitching. And if I'm using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, then that's why it's a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge.
Okay.
If you're using a larger seam allowance, then it would be a larger space away from the edge. And that's so we can create our miter there. So Cindy, do you want to take that to the sewing machine?
Yes, I think I want to pin it first a little bit. So it doesn't stretch on me.
Great.
We'll sewing the binding is just like icing on the cake, isn't it? Let's pull that. Pull out my pins.
Okay, when you get to that pin, stop. You can take a couple of back stitches there if you want to, and then we're going to remove it from the machine.
Okay. All right, I think we're good to go. All right, how'd I do?
Oh, that's beautiful, Cindy. Good job. She stopped right
there.
a 1/4 inch away from the end,
Okay.
and that's going to allow us to make this beautiful mitre on the corner.
Okay.
Okay, so some people will stop there and then actually pivot the machine and sew right off the corner.
You don't do that.
Yeah, it's your option.
And I don't usually do that either.
Okay.
So.
So now to make this mitre, we're going to fold this into a 45-degree angle here.
Okay.
And the way that I know that this is going to line up just right is if when I fold it, and I give a little finger press to that, a little fingernail, or you can press it if you want, so it lies flat. And then here's your gauge. Is this a straight line? Then
And
you
if that matches
then
up,
you know that that's a
good to go.
45-degree angle. There.
Okay.
Okay. And then the next thing, so step 1 is to fold it at the 45-degree angle. Step 2 is to bring that binding back down even so the fold is right at the corner.
So it lines up there.
Right, and this fold line is exactly along the edge of the quilt that you've just
And
sewn.
then this piece lines up.
We're going to sew to about here because we want to leave that
Plenty of
8-inch space to finish our last seam. Let's put a little pin here so that angle will stay when you take it to the sewing machine. And you're going to start right at the edge of the quilt
And just
and then
sew
stitch.
to about
Why
right
don't we
there.
go about right here? Okay.
Okay, great. Let's get
Go.
it done. Okay.
Oh, beautiful, Cindy. We're going to clip the threads. And just so you don't forget to do that later.
We have our little mitered
Little
corner.
test. Yeah, and it looks beautiful. It's going to be great.
Okay,
Okay.
so how do we finish our edge?
All right. This is the fun part. And maybe I should show this.
I don't think
Upside
this is the fun
down.
part, so I'm glad you're going to show me an easy
Okay.
tip.
So first I'll take the tail end of the binding that we've just applied. All right, and lay that down on the quilt. Nice and even with the edges again, but don't stretch or pull it, just as if you were sewing it. Okay? And then take your beginning tail and overlap that.
Okay.
And this is our 8 or 9 inch space to work with so that we can make that final diagonal bias seam. Now the reason that we do a bias seam on a binding is to distribute the bulk so you don't have a big lump, you know, on the
It's
edge of your
diagonal
binding.
when you roll it.
Right, it distributes
Sure.
the bulk. Okay, so you've laid the last tail down and the first tail
Overlap, like
over the
that.
front.
Okay.
Just to check. And then I make a little clip about 2/3 of the way through that space. I make a little clip through all 4 layers, all
Okay.
4 edges of your binding.
Okay.
Okay? Now I want you to just fold that in half and clip off
Okay.
the binding tail that's on the top.
Okay.
Just cut it straight. Okay, now what you've done is you've created your measuring tool. Here's our little notch on the underside tail, and we've created a little measuring tool so we know exactly how wide we need to overlap. So find your notch, line it up,
And you open it up. Okay.
and then you'll snip it right exactly
along the edge.
away from the snip. Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
good job. Now that should be exactly the width. That overlap should be exactly the width of the
Just
bias
like
strip, the strip that you've used.
that. Okay.
Now we're going to rotate it so we can demonstrate that a little clearer. All right, the strip on the bottom, we're going to open up and flatten right side up. So the fold line is up. Okay? And we're going to make a little V here. Would you hold that for a second?
Sure.
And then we're going to open up the other side.
A little tricky.
There we go.
It's always when you're on camera to get those.
With the fold line down, and sometimes, you know, you don't want to stretch. So I'm going to fold the quilt in half or even pin it. So we'll open that up so that the fold line is down.
Okay.
And then we're going to overlap. See that little notch that we made?
Yes.
That's where we're going to line up the top of our other piece here. Okay. And what we'll do is stitch from this corner to this corner. So we need an indication of where that is. And
That's
so you can either fold it, finger press that, or
take a pen.
yeah, we can just mark that. So you'll be stitching right on that line. It's just a 45-degree angle on the end of the upper strip here. So let's just take this and fold. We'll mark that just to be sure. Okay?
Yes. I always like to have a nice clear line where I'm supposed to sew
This
on.
color isn't showing very well, but
I can
you
see
get
it.
the idea. Okay, so remember we use that notch to line up the edge. And then we'll pin this and take it to the sewing machine.
Okay. We are almost done. That is a great tip.
So the way that you can check that
Would you
is,
pin this
is
up
it a
too?
V? Would you hand me a pin over there?
Okay.
Is it a V? And is the seam where we're going to stitch straight across? That's another little way to check yourself. So we're stitching from that point of that all the way to here. Okay?
Okay, let's
Ready
go
to go.
stitch that.
Okay, we can keep that folded and it'll relieve the pressure on that so it won't stretch the binding.
Alright.
Maybe even pin it.
I'll find my little sew line right there. Take out a pin. We'll get started. So we got that sewn.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Let's
Okay.
check it.
Oh, yeah,
Moment of truth.
that's right. We want to check and see if it's going to lay like it should before we trim.
Okay.
You don't want
We'll
to
do
trim
that.
that before you check that.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and trim that off. Just a 1/4 inch seam allowance or even less. Okay, 3/16. But
who's counting?
Yeah.
Who's counting?
and then we can finger press that or take it
And
to
you
the
open
iron.
your seams.
Always open the seam. I like my pressing. And then you'll be able to take that back to the sewing machine, start where you finished, and then just continue on.
Okay.
And it's then we'll be ready for the next step.
All right. So let's go sew that. I'm gonna just pin it a couple times. All right. So we finally sewed all the
Oh, look
way
at that seam.
around.
It's beautiful.
Okay.
Look at that. Okay, now we're ready for the next step.
We flip this over.
All right, we're going to take it to the sewing machine. Well, actually, let's press it first.
Okay.
Let's press it so that it's nice and tight against the back.
Okay. Okay. Nice press.
All right, we've pressed it away from the quilt back so it's nice and tight. And let's pin our miters
Okay.
so that when we machine stitch, we don't have to stop and bother. Okay, look how nicely that flips right over into a miter. We're going to echo that on the other side of it. And my rule of thumb is that the side that has the most bulk in the miter is the side that you right is the side that you fold over first to the front, and then we're going to create an echo of that miter on the other side. And if you do it with that first side with the bulky side, then that will help distribute the bulk in the corner.
Okay.
And
Oh, nice edge.
look at that. So we'll
Beautiful.
pin that. And then we'll just pin this. Meet those corners right up in your seam. It's beautiful. And we'll do that on all 4 corners.
Very
We could even
nice.
pin the rest of the binding to the quilt if
Okay.
we wanted to. But we'll do that on all four
We'll pin
corners.
that. And then I wanted to show the foot that we're going to use. This is a blind stitch foot. We're going to trade it out on our machine. This will help us to stitch right where we want our stitches to be, so they're perfect.
See how that foot just snugs right next to the edge of your binding and makes a beautiful straight line.
Okay, so we used a lot of different stitches to finish this binding. We used a straight stitch, and we used a bunch of our decorative stitches on
Well,
our
and your machine has about hundreds of
Yes, and it's a good
decorative
time if
stitches.
you've got a fancy machine like this to try out your different stitches and see what you like best to finish your binding.
Well, and it's a great way to finish a quilt, or in this case, a quilted pillow top.
And Deonn is going to be showing us how to do a finished pillow, how you do the backing of this on Cutting Corners College. So look for that. And you've got a finished pillow. You can add a little decorative embellishment on it, and it's personalized and it's finished, and you've learned how to do binding basics. So thanks, Deonn, for being here.
Oh, thanks, Cindy.